Fellas, welcome back to another No Heather OSRS video. Today I want to give you 10 tips for getting into PVM, especially if you're someone who's really never done it before. I would assume you probably know most of this stuff on this list if you've been into PVM at all in the past, but I think I'm an ideal candidate to give you some basic information that can help you out since, well, I'm he, but not him. I have a little bit of experience with pretty much every piece of PVM content in the game, and obviously I like some more than others, but honestly that's the fun part of PVM. You could probably do most of the content in the game right now. It's just taking the first step and learning the encounters so that you can find out what you enjoy and what you don't. The first and most basic thing I want to talk about is knowing your enemy. And for this, I divide it into two sections. Know what overhead prayer you need, and know when you're in danger. Doing a boss for the first time can be challenging for a variety of different reasons. But if you actually want to kill the boss, you should probably understand what you're meant to do before diving in head first. There is a large quantity of bosses that are actually quite simple, as long as you know what you're doing. A ton of them just require you to camp an overhead prayer and do damage. It gets a little bit more complicated if a boss uses multiple styles, say something like Hydra for example, so it's probably a good idea to know which attack is which before you jump in. I personally can never learn a boss just from watching a guide. I need to go there and try it, get that hands-on experience. But watching a guide for a specific boss and having that information up front makes it a lot less daunting when you know what to expect. Danger-wise, you just need to pay attention to the max hit of a monster. I'll use Duke Cecilus as an example since I'm pretty familiar with him now, but knowing the max hit can maximize your DPS. Eating food in this game is slow, and when you eat food, you typically lose DPS. Using Duke as an example, I know the max hit of a melee attack is 56, and it's 48 with a magic attack. With this information, I know that if my health is above 56 during the kill, I don't need to eat until the boss is dead, or I drop below that threshold. This is the same for every boss in the game. You really shouldn't be eating unless you need to. But hardcore Iron Man, feel free to play it safe if you really want to. This information won't make your kills 10 times faster or anything like that, but saving a few seconds every kill is massive in the long run, especially when a lot of bosses are required to be killed thousands of times for a pet, or hundreds of times for a rare drop. Next, I want to talk about one of the first mechanics that most people learn in PVM. This is flinching and the step under method. Flinching is pretty straightforward. If you can get a monster stuck around a corner or even behind a tree, you can hit the monster and step back before it can hit you. When you have it stuck, you're just waiting for its HP bar to disappear so you can get a free hit it. Step under is very similar, except instead of stepping away, you're stepping under the monster. This can delay their attack or even let you eat some food. In its most basic form, you'll use this at KQ. This boss will do massive damage to you regardless of what you're praying, but by stepping under it, you're able to eat back up without having to take more damage. As you progress and get more into PVM, you'll use this at places like God Wars Dungeon for both Zami and Bandos, but that's only if you aren't using the Bofa. You'll even use this at a place like Theater of Blood when you're tanking Verzik. A lot of PVM mechanics can be learned at safer bosses, and I say safer in quotations, but you can develop your skill set early on and then use it as you progress. Step under is a very basic mechanic, and it is pretty much vital in taking that first step into PVM. Next, we should probably talk about gear switching. At first, you'll most likely be doing bosses that don't require any gear switching, which is fine. But again, as you progress along your PVM journey, you'll probably want to try out some bosses where it's required or at least strongly recommended. Gear switching is quite unique to Runescape. There aren't really many other games that require you to switch your gear mid-fight, but it is super satisfying when done right. To be good at PVM, you don't need to one-tick an 8-way switch. You just need to develop that muscle memory that will allow you to change gear while not being overwhelmed by boss mechanics. When it comes to gear switching, I don't think anyone has ever really confirmed if there's a correct or most effective way to keep your gear in your inventory. It's mostly just your own personal preference. Personally, I keep my switches in a box of 4 if it's a 4-way switch for all 3 styles, or on 2 horizontal lines if it's more than that. If we use my Muspet gear setup as an example, I bring a 7-way switch, so I click up, down, diagonally up, and then I repeat the process. This is my personal preference, but you might find something that works easier for you. Gear switching is super important in PVM since it will maximize your DPS, making kills much faster and honestly, much more satisfying. At its most basic, you can learn how to gear switch somewhere like KQ by starting in melee and then switching to range as it progresses into phase 2. You could also develop this skill somewhere like DKs. This will let you switch gear between kills of each king, and it will help you transition between 3 styles instead of 2. As you progress, you can start trying gear switches at places like Zulrah or the Phantom Muspa, and these are both very similar to DKs where you have a window to switch gear, but now it will just be more pieces. Gear switching really peaks in raids where you'll need to switch gear multiple times for each boss, and sometimes even multiple times during a boss encounter for something like Akaru. And speaking of Akka, the next thing I want to talk about on this list is learning about movement. I've said it a few times in previous videos, but movement in this game is weird. Walking will generally keep you pretty close to your true tile, but running in this game actually moves you 2 tiles at a time. This means that your character is not visually where you actually are on the server. Using the True Tile plugin in RuneLite, we can get a better understanding of how we actually move, and honestly, I really recommend you use it until you have a basic understanding of it. You honestly don't need to know perfectly where you are at all times, but knowing this information will make you much better at any boss where it does require movement. At its most basic form, this can be utilized in combination with the step under method so that you can off-tick monsters and have time to change prayers. It can also be used at something like Hydra to drag the boss onto the correct vent, while also not cutting into your DPS. Movement is also very important in something like the Gauntlet for avoiding tornadoes, as well as the damage on the floor. But circling back to Akka, there is a very interesting mechanic here known as the butterfly method. This method utilizes pathing and precise timing to make him really never switch from melee, barring some RNG of course. And by doing this, you'll maximize your DPS if you're using the Busted as Shadow. But this will also let you preserve your food, which is very nice as you progress later into the raid. You'll also need to understand movement for a variety of different bosses in the Chamber of Xeric, the Theater of Blood, and of course the Tombs of Amasket. A good way to learn about movement while making a good amount of money, getting valuable skilling XP, and with little to no risk is doing the Hallowed Sepulchre. This place is great for understanding pathing and movement, so it's worth trying out and getting frustrated at until it clicks. If you want to PVM while practicing movement and pathing, Vorkath is a pretty good option. Here you can get a basic understanding by avoiding the mini fireballs, as well as eventually learning how to Woox Walk. There are a lot of options to learn how moving and pathing works, but it is super important to get a grasp on so that you can tackle those more challenging bosses. The next thing I want to talk about probably puts a lot of people off. It's dying. You can die in RuneScape, it's okay. If you're a hardcore Iron Man, maybe skip this one, but honestly, dying is okay. Dying in this game is actually one of the best ways to learn what you're doing wrong, as long as you can force yourself to say, okay, I died because this happened, and not saying you died because of a bug. Dying isn't like it was in 2010. You don't have 2 minutes before you lose your items forever. You get almost a full hour to get your stuff back at a expensive but reasonable fee, and honestly, even if something happens and you don't make it in that 1 hour window, you can still get your stuff back from Death's office at a greatly increased fee. But outside of that, you can reduce the cost of death by using the Protect from Item prayer, which honestly I do highly recommend if you're learning a boss, so that you can mitigate your losses and maintain your motivation to keep trying. Next, we should probably talk about what will make the biggest difference in your PVM experience, your combat levels. Just as an example, each strength level will increase your DPS significantly more than any armor ever will. Having that base stat is so much more beneficial than any gear upgrade ever could be. I wouldn't say you need to have 99 in all your combats, but pushing them up as high as you can, and honestly that includes prayer, will be incredibly beneficial to you. Leveling attack will increase your accuracy or your chance of hitting. Leveling strength will increase your max hit and increase your DPS across the board. Leveling defense will reduce the chances of you getting hit, meaning you take less damage overall and probably eat less food. Magic and range will essentially do the same as attack, but for their respective combat styles. And leveling your prayer lets you get more out of every prayer pot, offering you more prayer points per sip, lets you use higher level offensive prayers like Rigor, Piety, and Augury, as well as just letting you use prayer for longer. I always recommend you train your combat stats through Slayer, as it will give you a good head start at unlocking high level Slayer bosses, but honestly, Nightmare Zone is in the game. You can use it if you don't feel like doing Slayer. Getting that nice little head start in combat levels will make all PVM encounters much nicer. But we do know that all PVM encounters are doable at pretty much every combat level. We can see this through level 3 Fire Capes or level 50 Inferno Capes, or honestly whatever other example you can think of, but these require a very high technical understanding of the game, and each encounter is made significantly easier by leveling up. If you're just getting into PVM, I highly recommend going for something like base 80s with 70-ish prayer, and you should feel much more comfortable. And with DPS, I know I said gear doesn't matter, but let's be honest, although I personally think you'll get a lot more out of your weapon choice than your gear choice, it does affect your stats and in turn affects your DPS. Gear-wise, your goal should always be working towards getting best in slots like Torva, Masori, and Ancestral, but how do you get there without doing any PVM before that? There are plenty of gear sets that will offer you incredible bang for your buck. God D'hide is ever so slightly behind Arma, and it only costs a fraction of the price. An occult necklace offers you more DPS than a full set of Ancestral. That is correct, you get 10% from an occult necklace, and it only costs 500k. And for melee, the Osbumpton's Fang has basically destroyed every high defense level monster in the game, so you have options. You will have to use non-best in slot gear to get best in slot gear. So my only advice is just making sure you're using the best gear you have at the time and picking your gear for the situation you're putting yourself in. After DPS, we should probably talk about lag. Lag happens. We play a game that works in 0.6 second intervals, and when that gets delayed, it can feel very weird. If you've seen any other videos that I've ever posted, I always have this little green number on my screen. This is Tick Tracker. This is a RuneLite plugin that checks the latency of a tick. I could give you a hyper detailed analysis of how this works, but honestly, I'm going to make it really straightforward so it's very easy to understand. We play a game that has a 0.6 second delay. It's best to focus on consistency rather than latency. As an example, I'm in North America, but I typically use UK worlds for PVM since the ping is much more consistent. This isn't to say you should be in an Australian server if you're in North America, since then the latency will be too high. But finding a world that the player population is low and your ping is about 100, with the Tick Tracker plugin saying about 95% or above, will make your gameplay much smoother and less aggravating than a world that is 14 ping with thousands of players and the plugin saying 85%. This will make your clicks feel much more consistent and in the long run can save you a lot of mental anguish. But before we really wrap up the video, we obviously need to talk about prayer flicking. There are so many iterations of prayer flicking now that you should at least have a basic understanding of it if you want to do high level PVM. There's one tick flicking that will basically let you have infinite prayer if done correctly. This one is useful in a lot of situations, but it is very click intensive. People will use one tick flicking in Kefir Room to save prayer. It's obviously super useful in the Inferno, but honestly, a lot of times you'll just be camping overheads and focusing on movement or something else. So for this section, I just want to talk about prayer flicking in its most basic form, and this will be just changing prayer so that you have the correct one active at all times. You'll do this a lot, especially with new PVM encounters, since it's kind of the way they're going with PVM. I'm sure you've seen a bunch of people say that you should play on fixed mode because it's ideal, and honestly, this is true since you can condense the space you're taking in information, but the main thing is really just muscle memory. A good example of this are two of the new Desert Treasure 2 bosses, being the Leviathan and the Whisperer. During the Whisperer fight, you need to move while also changing your prayer on a pattern. Knowing when to change prayers and when to move is essential, but with something like the Leviathan, you'll need to be able to identify an attack that's coming towards you and then use the correct prayer. The Leviathan is actually a great place to learn this skill if you just run in with nothing equipped and just practice getting the prayers right. If you do this, you'll honestly pick this skill up quite quickly, and it can be used in a variety of different boss encounters. You'll use this skill in a variety of different places like the Wardens at TOA, Soat in TOB, and so many other bosses. And finally, to wrap this whole video up, the last thing I can say that will really help you is that you need to try new content. If you just keep doing the same bosses like Kraken or KBD over and over, you won't develop a skill set that crosses over into other bosses. By trying out new bosses, you can find what you like and what you don't like, and then you can very accurately pick and choose the content you want to interact with. If you're an Iron Man, you're sort of forced into certain pieces of content so you can get gear upgrades. So building skill sets on bosses that you do enjoy will help you tackle some of them that you maybe don't like so much. And that's 10 things that will help you get into PVM in 2023. I'm assuming you probably knew at least 9 of the 10 things on this list, but hopefully you got something useful from this video. This one is actually at the request of the big fella, DansSmeg'ead. I keep saying Ed, I'm trying to be British. Should I say head instead? But shout out to the big fella, thank you for the idea. But by becoming a big fella, you can actually request a video topic by clicking the join button below the video. That helps support me as well as giving you the exact content that you want to see. But as always, shout out to the fellas, Snacks, Jujo, and iTalk. I know PVM really isn't for everyone, and you really don't have to do it to enjoy this game. But if you do want to get into it, it's baby steps. Start easy and work your way up. KQ, DKs, and even something like Cerberus are great building blocks that will help you develop the skills you want to learn. But with all that said, I've really got nothing left to say, so I'll see you in the next one.